Imagine an emperor whose face has swollen so grotesquely that his own brother can't recognize him. Thousands of pustules erupt across his entire body, fill with pus, and burst simultaneously, turning his skin into a single continuous wound. The ruler of the largest empire in Europe lies in bed for 11 days while his body disintegrates from the outside in, leaking fluid constantly, the smell so overpowering that servants gag before entering the room. This is what smallpox does when it doesn't kill quickly but takes its time, and this is what happened to Joseph I, Holy Roman Emperor, in April 1711. He didn't die in battle or from poison or any of the dramatic causes that typically end powerful men. He died because a virus destroyed his skin's ability to protect him, and once that barrier failed, his body simply came apart over 10 days while he remained conscious enough to understand every moment. What you're about to hear is documented by the physicians who watched him die and couldn't stop it, and not everyone will make it to the end. But to understand how an emperor could rot alive in his own palace, you need to go back to where it started. Joseph became emperor in 1705 at the age of 26 when his father Leopold died after ruling for nearly half a century. The inheritance was massive and complicated, stretching from the Spanish Netherlands through the German states down into northern Italy and east into Hungary and Bohemia, a patchwork empire held together more by dynastic marriage and military force than by any natural unity. Joseph had been raised for this role from childhood, educated in multiple languages, trained in statecraft and military theory, married at 17 to Wilhelmina Amalia of Brunswick in a calculated alliance meant to secure Protestant support for Catholic Habsburg interests. He produced 2 daughters, which was acceptable but not ideal since the empire needed male heirs to maintain stability, and by 1711 he'd been ruling for 6 years with reasonable competence during one of the most destructive wars Europe had yet seen. The War of Spanish Succession was still grinding through its second decade when Joseph took power, a sprawling conflict that had started because the Spanish Habsburg line had died out and every major power in Europe wanted to control who would replace them. The French supported one candidate, the Austrians and British supported another, and the fighting had spread across multiple continents as colonial possessions became part of the prize. Joseph had managed the Austrian side of this war without making catastrophic mistakes, keeping his armies funded, maintaining alliances with England and the Dutch, holding the empire together despite the enormous financial and human costs of continuous warfare. By early 1711, the situation was actually looking favorable for the Habsburgs. French military power was exhausted, their treasury empty, their population decimated by years of war and poor harvests. There were serious peace negotiations beginning, and there was a real possibility that Austria would emerge from the war in a stronger position than it had entered, potentially gaining territory in Italy and the Netherlands while keeping France contained. Joseph was in Vienna that April, managing the complex diplomacy and administration required to run an empire at war. The city itself was recovering from a major outbreak of plague that had killed thousands just a few years earlier, and there was always disease circulating through the crowded streets and the even more crowded court, but this was normal for the 18th century and not something that would have particularly concerned an emperor who had more pressing matters to deal with. He attended meetings, reviewed military dispatches, made decisions about troop deployments and alliance negotiations, maintained the elaborate ceremonial schedule that Habsburg rulers were expected to follow. His routine was demanding but manageable, and there was no indication that anything was wrong until the second week of April when he started feeling sick in a way that seemed unremarkable at first. The fever came on gradually, accompanied by the kind of body aches and fatigue that could signal anything from a spring cold to overwork. Joseph tried to push through it because emperors don't have the luxury of taking sick days when there are wars to manage and treaties to negotiate, but within 48 hours he was too ill to maintain his schedule. The headache had become severe, the fever was climbing, and he developed nausea and back pain that made it difficult to sit upright for extended periods. The court physicians were summoned, and they performed their examinations with the limited tools and knowledge available in 1711, checking his pulse, examining his tongue and the whites of his eyes, asking questions about his symptoms. They diagnosed a fever of unknown origin and prescribed the standard treatments of the era, which meant bloodletting to balance his humors, herbal preparations to reduce the fever, and bed rest until the illness passed. What they were doing was essentially guesswork dressed up in medical terminology, but it was the best that early 18th century medicine could offer. On the third day after the fever started, something appeared on Joseph's skin that changed the diagnosis immediately. Small red spots emerged on his face and hands, flat against the skin at first but clearly distinct from normal complexion. Over the next several hours, the spots multiplied rapidly, spreading from his face down his neck onto his chest and back, appearing on his arms and legs, covering more and more of his body surface with each passing hour. The physicians recognized what they were seeing because smallpox was common enough in that era that any experienced physician had seen multiple cases. The pattern was unmistakable, the dense rash appearing first on the extremities and face before spreading to the trunk, the rapid progression, the way the spots were uniform in their development rather than appearing in random clusters. This was variola major, the most lethal form of smallpox, and once the rash appeared there was nothing anyone could do to stop what would happen next. Smallpox in 1711 killed roughly 3 out of every 10 people it infected, and the ones who survived were often left blind or covered in permanent scars where the pustules had destroyed the deeper layers of skin. There was no treatment that worked, no medication that could stop the virus from replicating, no way to prevent the disease from progressing through its stages. The physicians knew this, but their role wasn't to cure Joseph, because cure wasn't possible. Their role was to manage his symptoms, keep him as comfortable as they could, and document what happened for the medical records. They increased the frequency of bloodletting under the theory that this would help balance his system, though in reality it just weakened him further. They applied poultices to his skin, gave him herbal preparations meant to draw out toxins, adjusted his diet to foods that were considered easier to digest. None of it would make any difference to the outcome, but doing something was better than admitting they were helpless. The rash evolved quickly over the next 24 hours, transforming from flat red spots into raised bumps that you could feel by running a hand over Joseph's skin. These bumps were papules, the next stage in smallpox's progression, and they marked the point where the virus had begun destroying skin cells in earnest. Each papule represented a site where the virus was replicating inside skin cells, killing them and triggering an inflammatory response that caused the surrounding tissue to swell. Within another day, the papules had filled with clear fluid and become vesicles, small blisters that covered Joseph's entire body in a dense pattern that left almost no skin unaffected. They were on his face, in his mouth, on his tongue, and the inside of his cheeks. They covered his torso front and back, his arms and legs, his hands and feet, his groin and buttocks. There was no area of his skin that the virus had spared, and each vesicle was a point of pain because the skin was being damaged and stretched by the fluid accumulating beneath it. The transformation from vesicles to pustules took another 2 days, and this is where smallpox becomes truly monstrous, because pustules aren't superficial blemishes but deep lesions that extend down through multiple layers of skin tissue. The clear fluid inside the vesicles turned cloudy, then yellow, then a thick greenish yellow as white blood cells flooded into the damaged tissue and died there, their remnants mixing with dead skin cells and viral particles to create pus. The pustules swelled as they filled, raising up from the skin surface, stretching the tissue tight around them until each one looked like a small dome filled with thick fluid. The pressure was painful, a constant burning tension across every part of Joseph's body simultaneously, and the pain was compounded by inflammation in the tissue surrounding each pustule as his immune system tried desperately to fight an infection it couldn't control. What made this particularly horrific for Joseph was that pustules and smallpox don't just appear on the skin surface but also develop on mucous membranes inside the body. His mouth was lined with them, making swallowing painful and eating nearly impossible. His throat had pustules that triggered choking sensations and made breathing feel obstructed even though his airway wasn't actually blocked. The inside of his nose developed pustules that made breathing through his nose difficult as they swelled and eventually ruptured, filling his nasal passages with discharge. Even his eyes were affected, with pustules developing on the conjunctiva and inside his eyelids, causing intense pain and photophobia that made opening his eyes an ordeal. He was being attacked from inside and outside simultaneously, his body turning against itself under the virus's direction. The appearance of Joseph's face changed so dramatically during the pustular stage that people who'd known him for years found him difficult to recognize. The pustules on facial skin caused massive swelling because facial tissue has a rich blood supply and responds to inflammation with significant edema. His features became distorted, his normal facial structure disappearing under the swelling. His eyelids puffed up so severely that his eyes were reduced to slits, barely able to open even when he tried. His lips swelled and split, the pustules on them cracking open as the tissue stretched, leaving raw bleeding areas that made any facial movement painful. His nose became bulbous and deformed, the pustules there merging into larger masses. His ears swelled, the pustules in and around them causing them to stick out from his head at odd angles. The man who'd been physically fit and reasonably handsome a week earlier had become something that looked barely human, his face a mask of swollen, distorted flesh covered in raised yellow lesions. The pustulation phase lasted about 5 days, during which Joseph's condition deteriorated in ways that went beyond just the visible skin lesions. The sheer number of pustules covering his body meant that massive amounts of his skin's surface area were damaged simultaneously, and skin isn't just a covering but an organ with critical functions that fail when it's compromised. One of the first functions to fail was temperature regulation, because skin controls body heat through blood flow adjustment and sweating, and when the skin is covered in pustules and inflammation, that control system stops working properly. Joseph's temperature would spike into high fevers that left him delirious, confused about where he was and who was around him, trying to get out of bed because he didn't understand why he was confined. Then his temperature would crash and he would shake with chills so violent that attendants had to pile blankets on him to try to stop the shaking. The swings happened multiple times a day, his body unable to maintain stable temperature because the organ that normally regulated it was too damaged to function. Fluid loss became critical as the pustules reached their maximum size and began to rupture. A pustule can only hold so much pressure before the skin over it breaks down, and when it ruptures it releases all the fluid inside, a mixture of pus, serum, blood, and viral particles. With thousands of pustules covering Joseph's body, the rupturing happened continuously as some lesions burst from pressure while others broke when he moved or when physicians tried to examine him. Each ruptured pustule left behind a raw crater where the protective skin barrier was completely gone, and these craters wept fluid constantly, soaking through his bedding and nightclothes within hours. The servants had to change his sheets multiple times a day, a task that became increasingly difficult as Joseph became too weak and too pain-ridden to cooperate with being moved. Every time they shifted him to change the bedding, more pustules would rupture from the pressure and friction, causing more pain and more fluid loss and more risk of infection. The smell in Joseph's chambers became overwhelming as secondary bacterial infections established themselves in his damaged skin. Human skin is normally colonized by bacteria that live on the surface without causing problems because an intact epidermis keeps them from penetrating deeper, but when that barrier is destroyed across large areas of the body, those bacteria have unrestricted access to underlying tissue. Staphylococcus and Streptococcus species, normal skin flora, became opportunistic pathogens, multiplying in the warm moist environment of the ruptured pustules and causing additional inflammation and pus production. The smell they generated was the smell of infected tissue, a thick sweet rotting odor that heavy applications of perfume and incense couldn't mask. Servants who had to enter the room would tie cloths soaked in vinegar over their noses and mouths, though this did little to block the stench. The smell announced to anyone in the vicinity that something was dying, and that something was still technically alive but not for much longer. Dehydration became severe as Joseph lost fluid through his damaged skin faster than he could replace it by drinking. The weeping craters where pustules had ruptured were leaking serum continuously, and with much of his body surface affected, the total volume of fluid loss was enormous. His mouth and throat were so damaged by pustules that swallowing was difficult and painful, making it hard to get fluids into him even when he was conscious enough to try. His tongue swelled and developed a thick coating as dehydration progressed. His lips cracked and bled. His eyes sank back into their swollen sockets as the tissues around them lost fluid. The physicians tried to force him to drink water, wine, broths, anything that might help replace what he was losing, but even when they succeeded in getting liquid down his throat, it wasn't enough to compensate for the continuous leakage from his skin. The bacterial infections spreading through his damaged skin began entering his bloodstream, seeding his body with pathogens that triggered a systemic inflammatory response. "This is sepsis," though 18th century physicians wouldn't have had that term or understood the mechanism. What they observed was that Joseph's breathing became rapid and shallow, his heart rate increased to the point where they could see his pulse pounding in his neck, and his extremities began to turn dusky as his blood pressure dropped and circulation to his fingers and toes decreased. He became increasingly difficult to rouse, slipping in and out of consciousness, sometimes responding to questions and sometimes staring blankly at nothing. His body was shutting down organ by organ as the infection overwhelmed his immune system's ability to fight it. His kidneys failed as the combination of dehydration, low blood pressure, and bacterial toxins circulating in his blood overwhelmed their capacity to filter waste. His urine output dropped to almost nothing, and what little urine he did produce was dark and concentrated, indicating severe kidney dysfunction. The waste products that should have been eliminated through his urine began accumulating in his bloodstream, causing uremia that made him nauseated and worsened his confusion. His liver, working to process the bacterial toxins and support his failing metabolism, began to fail as well, though the physicians wouldn't have been able to identify that specifically. What they saw was that Joseph was becoming progressively weaker, less responsive, less able to perform even basic functions like swallowing or opening his eyes. The pustules on Joseph's face were among the last to rupture because facial skin is thicker than skin on other parts of the body, but when they finally did break open, the damage was catastrophic to his appearance. The ruptured pustules left raw weeping craters across his entire face, destroying any remaining resemblance to the man he'd been. The skin around his eyes was so damaged that his eyelids couldn't close properly, leaving his eyes partially exposed even when he was unconscious. His lips had essentially disintegrated into a mass of raw tissue that bled continuously. His cheeks and forehead were covered in overlapping craters that leaked pus and serum constantly. The hair on his head had begun falling out in patches where the pustules on his scalp had destroyed the hair follicles, leaving areas of exposed damaged skin that stuck to his pillows when he lay down. Inside his mouth, the situation was equally devastating. The pustules that had developed on his tongue, the inside of his cheeks, and his gums had ruptured and left ulcerated areas that made any attempt to eat or drink an ordeal. His tongue was swollen to the point where it barely fit in his mouth, covered in white and yellow patches where the lesions were. The back of his throat was so damaged that swallowing triggered intense pain and sometimes caused him to gag or choke. He'd essentially stopped eating entirely during the final days, which meant his body was being starved at the same time it was dealing with massive infection and fluid loss. The physicians tried to feed him soft foods and liquids, but Joseph refused most attempts because the pain outweighed any benefit from the minimal nutrition. By mid-April, about 10 days after the first symptoms had appeared, Joseph was clearly dying. The pustular eruption had run its course, meaning no new lesions were forming, but the existing damage was so extensive that his body couldn't recover. Much of his skin surface was raw and exposed, leaking fluid constantly, providing endless entry points for bacteria. The secondary infections had spread throughout his body, his organs were failing, and his immune system was exhausted from fighting a battle it could never win. The physicians knew there was nothing more they could do beyond trying to keep him comfortable with opiates, though even large doses of laudanum weren't enough to fully control the pain. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to recognize his wife and brother when they came to his bedside, other times too delirious to understand where he was or what was happening. Joseph died on April 17, 1711, 11 days after the fever first started. The immediate cause was probably cardiovascular collapse, his heart finally giving out under the combined strain of infection, dehydration, and organ failure. He was 32 years old, physically fit before the illness, ruler of an empire that stretched across half of Europe, and he died because a virus had turned his skin into something that could no longer function as skin, and once that happened, every other system in his body failed in sequence. His death wasn't quick or merciful or dignified. It was a slow dissolution that took place over 10 days while he remained conscious enough to experience most of it, his body literally coming apart while physicians and family members watched helplessly. The body had to be prepared for burial quickly because it was still infectious and already decomposing rapidly. Smallpox virus remains viable in the fluid from pustules and in the scabs that form over them for weeks after death, meaning anyone who handled Joseph's corpse was at risk of contracting the disease. The servants assigned to wash and dress the body for burial worked in multiple layers of protective clothing, though this was more superstition than effective barrier against viral transmission. They had to clean skin that was still covered in ruptured pustules and weeping lesions, still leaking fluid, still giving off the smell of infected tissue. They dressed him in burial clothes that would hide the worst of the damage, though nothing could hide what his face had become. The decision was made to seal his coffin quickly without the usual extended lying-in-state period, both because of the infection risk and because the body was deteriorating too rapidly to preserve even with the embalming techniques available in 1711. The funeral was held with full imperial ceremony, but it was rushed by Habsburg standards. Normally an emperor would lie in state for weeks while nobles from across the empire came to pay respects, but Joseph was buried within days of his death, his sealed coffin preventing anyone from seeing what smallpox had done to him. The official cause of death was recorded as variola, smallpox, which was obvious to anyone who'd been in the palace during his final days. What the official records didn't capture was the specific horror of how he died, the way his skin had essentially been destroyed across his entire body, the way he'd remained conscious through much of the process, the way a virus had reduced the most powerful man in Europe to a mass of suppurating wounds that leaked and stank and finally stopped functioning. From a medical standpoint, what killed Joseph was the systemic failure that occurs when skin integrity is lost across large areas of the body simultaneously. Skin is the body's largest organ and serves multiple critical functions beyond just being a barrier. It regulates temperature, prevents water loss, blocks pathogen entry, synthesizes vitamin D, provides sensory information about the environment. When smallpox destroys skin across most of the body surface, all these functions fail at once, and the result is a cascade of medical crises that 18th century medicine had no way to address. Joseph died of dehydration, sepsis, organ failure, and cardiovascular collapse, all of which were direct consequences of his skin no longer being able to do its job. The political consequences of Joseph's death were immediate and significant. He'd been in the middle of negotiating an end to the War of Spanish Succession, and his death changed the calculation for all parties involved. His brother Charles, who'd been fighting in Spain as the Habsburg candidate for the Spanish throne, was now also Holy Roman Emperor, which made him too powerful for the other European states to accept controlling both Spain and Austria. The war would eventually end with Charles getting the Austrian lands but not Spain, a compromise that probably would have happened differently if Joseph had lived to finish the negotiations himself. The Habsburg dynasty continued, but it lost the opportunity to expand its power at a critical moment, and that loss can be traced directly to a smallpox infection that started with a fever in early April and ended with an emperor's skin dissolving while he was still alive. The broader lesson, if there is one beyond the simple horror of the story, is that biological reality doesn't respect power or position. Joseph had access to the best medical care available in early 18th century Europe, which admittedly wasn't saying much, but even if he'd had access to the best modern medicine, there was nothing that could have saved him once the disease progressed to its fulminant stage. Smallpox in its most severe form kills by destroying the barrier between the body and the environment, and once that barrier is gone, the body can't maintain the internal conditions necessary for survival. Joseph died because his skin stopped being skin and became instead a continuous wound that leaked his life away over the course of 10 days while everyone around him watched and could do nothing except document his deterioration for the historical record. The virus didn't care that he was emperor, and his empire couldn't protect him from something that lived in his cells and destroyed them from the inside out.